We're really excited to jump into Psychology 101. By the way, this was my undergraduate major for about a year before I switched to broadcast journalism. So I'm not a psychologist, but I play one on TV. And with me is Deborah Small, who's a professor of marketing and psychology at Wharton. And I know you know a lot about consumer behavior. Give me a sense of what you're looking at. What tells you how consumers are behaving right now?
First, thanks for having me here. Welcome back to school, Contessa. And we'll go back to Psychology 101, but we'll put it into the marketplace, right? And so that's what I study. I'm in a business school, and so I study how people make decisions and think in the marketplace as consumers. And so one of the most interesting, so the people use the word unprecedented about the pandemic pretty much every day, and it's totally true in the context of consumer behavior, because consumers are typically pretty habit driven, right? So we don't change very easily, and we're loss averse too, meaning losses loom larger than gains. And so anytime we even contemplate changing our behavior or breaking a habit, it's very hard. It's an uphill battle because what we're giving up when we change always weighs more heavily in our minds than what we're gaining. And so to suddenly be thrown into this setting where we can no longer maintain various habits that we have, right? We can't socialize at restaurants and bars and coffee shops. We can't go to our exercise classes at the gym. We can't go to use education in typical ways or visit supermarkets in the ways that we once used to visit them. Not to mention all of the new restrictions and other forms of behavioral change that we had to endure, such as mask wearing and social distancing. And so there's been a lot of change, and it's persisted for a while. And that was hard for consumers, and I think a lot of consumers miss things about the way things used to be. But it also provides some interesting opportunities for consumers, because what sort of a downside of our habit-like nature is that we don't explore alternatives very often once we're in habits. So there could be better options for us out there, and yet we're never learning about them because we're stuck in our habits. And so sometimes being forced to change can be a good opportunity to learn about yourself and learn what you like. And so take the example of exercise classes. So imagine you are somebody who used to go to the gym all the time, and then you couldn't. So you started exercising from home. Well, you might really miss that old way. Maybe there are aspects of it that you just couldn't be replicated well at home, and you're dying to get back. And so through the experience of working out from home, you learn about yourselves, you kind of reconfirm your original preferences. On the other hand, there might be consumers who try out this new form and recognize, hey, this is actually more convenient for me, it's better for me in a number of ways. And so it'll be interesting to see, but I think that a lot of ways in which people consumed pre-pandemic won't necessarily return to those levels. Like we've all been kind of permanently changed by the different experiences that we've had during this past year plus.
Well, and it happens so in such a global way that unlike a hurricane that might change behavior in a region for a while, this was global in scope, and it happened to everybody, no matter what the demographics were. You know, it's interesting when you're talking about the ways that this changes consumer behavior. The companies I cover for CNBC casinos are reporting that they got a surge of younger players, which is not traditional. Normally, most of the players in a casino would be, say, 65 and older. Though those people were all worried, they stayed at home. Younger players came in because there was a lack of other options for what to do. And what has been surprising to the casinos is that as 65-year-olds and older got vaccinated and have returned to the casinos, they've still retained those younger players because those players discovered, to your point, something that they didn't know that they were going to like. But do you think there's a danger in business categorizing their customers in a pre-pandemic, mid-pandemic, and post-pandemic buckets?
I think that's a reasonable starting point. in order to make predictions and to make sense of things, we tend to categorize. And so I think that's a reasonable way to start. I think it's dangerous to categorize all consumers. I say this, all consumers are the same in those different time periods, because there is an enormous heterogeneity or variation across consumers in their views, their risk preferences, their political ideology, and all of this stuff is kind of shaping the way these changes are affecting them.
Well, how do you gauge that in this changing paradigm? Now we're talking about not social distancing anymore, but this reopening, and as requirements and restrictions start coming down and easing, and that is pretty much across the board. How do we go about gauging what customers are anticipating, what they expect, especially because I don't know, do they even know?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the first thing to keep in mind is that risk perception is not risk. Risk is reality, it's truth. Risk perception is psychology. It's what we feel, it's what we think, right? And truth in some cases might not be perfectly knowable anyway. But even aside from that, risk perception it's a function of a variety of different things. It's partly our personalities, but even more than it's our personalities, it's the culture that we live in and the information that we consume. And as you in the media probably know, I'm sure you know, is that information is really varied, right? And it's a function, these days it's really largely a function of political ideology. And so we have very different information consumption via media, but that's also compounded by the fact that our social networks are largely sort of overlapping in political ideology. And so people are talking to other people who are listening to the same information. And so you have kind of clusters of people and regions of people in the US that have, very strong concerns about COVID that might be more risk averse than the actual risk warrants. And then you have the polar opposite extreme, in which there's a feeling of kind of invulnerability in spite of risks. And then you have shades in between, and you have regions of the US in which there's mixtures of these different types of people. And so I think it really kind of behooves businesses to try to understand, measure, understand where their customers are coming from.
Well, how do they do that?
So if they have the resources, I think market research is a science. It's full of wonderful tools that can calculate and measure people's concerns, their preferences, their desires in a variety of ways. But if a small business, for instance, can't afford to use those tools, I think there are some low-tech substitutes that often can be better than nothing at all. And so you can create your own surveys using free tools online. You can, on Instagram, you can do polls to ask your customers questions. I think that the key thing is that we tend to, as part of our human nature, is that we tend to be overconfident. We tend to think we know our customers really well, and oftentimes our intuitions aren't correct. And so it's really, really useful to ask your customers, not just assume that you know what they feel and what they think and what they believe. Ask them those questions.
And Jerlyn has chimed in here, and she says, where can we get statistical information on current consumer behavior? Are there resources that you look to on a regular basis to assess how consumers are feeling?
I think so actually somebody else in the chat mentioned earlier, I think Google Trends is a really good resource that's sort of easy to use and helpful in that respect. So I would start there.
Okay, and when we're looking at, especially post-pandemic, do you think that there's a risk for people of identifying their business with safe health and safety standards? I mean, we see this everywhere. Here's the cleaning products we use, and they've got it all prominently posted. And now that we're coming out of the pandemic and we're starting to get vaccinated and we're turning corners, is there a risk to maintaining that pandemic mindset?
Good. Yeah. So I think it's for a lot of people, it's going to take some time to get over our concerns. And so I think for the most part, that's really smart. However, I think as you're implying or suggesting, because of the kind of the political polarization, there are kind of factions of society that are really kind of concerned that we've gone too far. and there might be some backlash towards businesses that are overemphasizing this stuff as not, what's one person's reality might be, somebody else's bias, right? And so this is a kind of a tricky balancing act that businesses, particularly if you're kind of in a purple state right now, right, might have to navigate, and thinking through, what's going too far, what's not doing enough. And so one thing I strongly recommend, if that's the case for you and your business, is to consider various ways of doing segmentation. So I think you all know that not all customers are the same. That's why we offer assortments. That's why we offer different things, so that people can find that meet their needs in different ways. But I think right now, because of this heterogeneity in the way people think about risk and precaution, we need to be thinking about segmentation on that dimension. So offering different business hours, for instance.
Now, Melissa Hinton has asked that, like, if you want people to come back inside. I know a lot of employers are trying to do this now, convincing their employees it's time to come back to work. But if you're trying to coax your customers back inside, are there strategies that you can employ that's going to assure them, to coax them, to lure them back indoors?
Right. Yeah. So as you mentioned, safety precautions, if what's keeping them out is fear and concern about safety, then posting those precautions is really helpful. I mean, I think another thing that's been a wonderful set of innovations among many small businesses where I live, and I've seen elsewhere too, is figuring out more ways to do things outdoors, right? And we've learned so much in recent months about a better safety, lower risk in outdoor environments. And so when that's possible, I think that's great. And that's why didn't we think of that before?
Right. I was interested in this survey by Forrester that showed 75% of those who were asked said they think the pandemic will drive long-term changes in their consumer behavior. And traditionally, consumers underestimate those changes. They tend to think that they're going to be smaller than they actually are. When will we have a sense of just how much we as a consumer group have changed because of the pandemic?
Gosh, I mean, I think it's going to happen gradually over time, right? And it's not going to be the same for every industry. I know I work in education, so we've been talking a lot about changes in higher ed and other forms of education. For a long time, we've been doing minor innovations with virtual education, but then suddenly everything was virtual education, and we've learned a lot. We've learned what doesn't work as well as in the classroom, and we've learned some things that work better. And so I think it's really going to be in many ways sort of up to industries to figure out the right balancing act. And then, it's important to recognize also that it's not like consumer behavior was totally static before this, right? Mm-hmm. So we're talking kind of longer term changes, but they're not permanent changes.
I've got another question here from David, who said he's talking about, this issue of social justice is everywhere. We spend a lot of time talking about the pandemic, but certainly the movement towards social justice has been fierce. It's been vociferous. It's been upfront. It's grabbed headlines. Do you think that is also something that businesses need to think, how do I connect with my customers over this? Maybe take a stand. What's your thinking about the way this affects consumer psychology and behavior?
Great. Yeah. So it's another also politically polarized topic, right? So as strong as that movement has been, and how focal it's been in culture, there's also been a big backlash towards it in certain communities. And so I think that a lot of businesses have already been taking a stand in little ways and bigger ways, right? So there's been a lot of what sort of some people call like slacktivism, like posting messages on Instagram in support of Black Lives Matter. That's making a statement, but not a very costly statement. And then there's been, I think, more significant efforts in terms of hiring and representation and so on. So I think that's going to continue. That's going to continue to be a pressing issue.
Do you think businesses have to take a stand one way or the other?
Oftentimes they do. They get forced into it. I think about Starbucks that wasn't trying to necessarily enter into political issues, and customers partly own these brands, right? These bigger brands, at least, and so customers kind of sometimes force brands or companies to talk about these issues.
There's a lot of challenges right now because people are coming off of varying stages of hardship. They may have had to close for months and months, or perhaps the pandemic led to a boost. They transitioned, they started a business. So business owners, entrepreneurs are coming at this from many different areas. When you think about the behavior of consumers, what's your best advice for taking where you are in this moment, capitalizing on it, and pushing ahead to the future?
Great question. I would say is try to reflect on what you've learned from having to change so much already. I think I'm so impressed by the innovations that businesses have come up with, the way they've been so adaptive to this. And so know that. I think that's like, trust yourself and know that if you adapted before, you can adapt again, right? And what can you learn from the way in which you adapted before and apply moving forward, right? And the other key, you asked for one, but I'm going to tell you two. The second thing I advise is again, just listen to your customers. Don't just go with your intuition and making these decisions, but talk to your customers, seek feedback from them, and try to understand what they care about and what they're concerned about.
Will they tell you the truth? Especially if you're asking them face to face, will customers be honest about their experience?
Well, you don't have to ask them face to face. If you do surveys and things like that, those can be more anonymous. I think generally, yes, they will tell the truth. There are exceptions to that, of course, on more sensitive subjects. But I think as a general rule, the customers want your services, right? And if they're your customers, they probably also you have some relationship with them, and they want you to do well as a business. And so I think it's in their interest to be honest. And we all had a lot of time to reflect in the last year too. So they have opinions.
They do, and they have digital proficiency now. So getting them on text or via an app, if you're setting up an app, you may find that your customers have more digital proficiency since the pandemic, and work from home, as you know, has changed so many things as well. Professor Small, thank you so much for our introduction to consumer psychology. It's really fascinating, and thank you all for joining in. Thank you for your questions and for your chat. I hope that you found it illuminating as well.